Hello, my geeslings. It is Robinson, Mother Goose, the introduction to Robinson's podcast, episode number 39. And this episode is with Peter Adamson, whose titles I'm going to read just to make sure that I get them right. That he is professor of philosophy in late antiquity and in the Islamic world at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, and professor of ancient and medieval philosophy at King's College London. He is also the host of the really terrific podcast, The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. And he's the author of the book series by the same name, in which he's turned his podcast episodes into books. The show, like I said, is great. I am still relatively close to the beginning of the history of philosophy. I just finished some 15 or 20 episodes on Aristotle, and there is plenty more to come. He's been working on the show for over a decade now, I think, and like I said, there's plenty left because there's a lot of philosophizing going on the past 2,000 years. As you can guess, we talked about the history of philosophy. We talked in particular about one of Peter's specializations, which is Islamic philosophy, or as he likes to think of it, philosophy in the Islamic world. And we talk a bit about why that is. And we also talk a bit about some adjacent issues in ancient philosophy. In particular, we talk about what Islamic philosophy is. We talk about Peter's relationship to it. We talk about dead languages and some of the languages that he knows. I always find talking about language and etymology interesting. We also talk about some idiosyncratic problems of Islamic philosophy relating to the Koran. And so we talk about free will, the metaphysical status of the Koran, and how that relates to similar problems in Christian philosophy, like how exactly it is that the Eucharist is supposed to turn wine and bread into the blood and body of Christ. And we also talk about the eternity of the world. So whether time has a beginning or an ending from this medieval Islamic perspective. We talk about Illuminationism and philosophical mysticism, which in Arabic, I'm not sure if it's Arabic or what it is, but that's Sufism. We also talk about reincarnation and vegetarianism, and then we also talk about his podcast. Now, one of the great things about talking to Peter, something I've learned about historians in general, is their minds work very differently from mine, and that mine is not a really great repository of facts, but it very much seemed like I could ask Peter about anything that happened anywhere in philosophy in the last 2,000 years, and he would have had a very sophisticated and well thought out answer for me. And it's just really, it makes interviewing very, very easy because I don't have to worry about asking the wrong questions, and I can ask exactly what I'm curious about and know that I'm going to get a great answer. So Peter was great, and there were lots of stones left unturned. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to talk again in the future. Now, one caveat to this episode is that there were some recording issues. So we weren't able to record on my preferred platform, which is Riverside FM. And the reason that I like that platform is that it records me or my audio and my guest's audio to separate tracks. So if one of us is louder than the other, I can adjust the audio, but instead we had to use Zoom. So we were recording to a single track, and that just makes fussing with the audio much more difficult. Anyway, I think I did a decent job and managed it. And anyway, I mean, this podcast was a great one, and I hope you guys enjoy it as much as I did. So the idea of studying Islamic philosophy had never occurred to me before. And this isn't just particular to Islamic philosophy. I mean, I'm always hearing about various philosophies that had never occurred to me before. So I mentioned
Right.
Paul Woodruff. We talked about philosophy of war, philosophy and war, and I had never heard about that before he suggested talking about it. So I'm curious how you ended up getting drawn into it, given that
Yeah.
I'd never even
So
encountered it before.
actually, can I first say something about the kind of meta question behind your question, which is like, is there anything that there couldn't be philosophy of? Right. So could you have philosophy of cheese, philosophy of cats? And I mean, actually, you can definitely have philosophy of cats, right? So animal minds, right?
Yeah.
Animal ethics. So that's basically
Yeah.
philosophy of cats, not specifically cats, but you can use
Right.
cats
Right.
as an example, right? And actually, I sort of, one thing that I've come to think from doing all this history of philosophy stuff with the podcast and so on is that really you can uh, usefully think philosophically about absolutely anything. And also, and this sort of brings me back to your real question, that you can think about philosophy in any culture. So we tend to think that philosophy is this thing that the Greeks invented and it got passed down through European philosophy. Um, and then people who are more kind of clued into the existence of philosophy in other cultures think, oh, of course, there's philosophy in India and China. But from doing Africana philosophy on my podcast, that really kind of brought home to me that there's always going to be material from any culture, even if it's very long ago and we don't have very much information about it. That every culture has something in it that you can think about and engage with philosophically. It might even be only like inscriptions or even material culture. Like it might not be texts even. It might be dealing with ethnographical reports about what they say and so on. Like, for example, in African philosophy, there's a lot of discussion about pre-colonial traditions that have to some extent survived down to the modern era and survived for long enough that there are reports about them that people can then engage with and so on. So actually, by all of that, if like that's your standard, like there's philosophy everywhere, whenever there are humans there's philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
then actually philosophy in the Islamic world is kind of a slam dunk. So it's much closer to Greek philosophy than it is to, say, uh, let's say Mesoamerican philosophy. So I mean, I'm like a very strong believer that the Aztecs and Incans produced things that we can study philosophically and that they should be integrated in the history of philosophy. And I would hope to cover them someday in my podcast. But the kind of methodological issues that arise with the Islamic world are not nearly so difficult because they translated Aristotle and Plato. Well, not so much Plato, but they translated a lot of Aristotle into Arabic and they write commentaries on Aristotle. And in fact, there's a very kind of continuous tradition of philosophy from late antiquity where you have people writing about Aristotle and Plato in Greek and then the Arabic philosophical tradition. And so, even though a lot of the thinkers that we deal with in this field lived maybe even in Central Asia, like Ibn Sina, who we usually call Avicenna in English. So he lived in Afghanistan and Persia, but in some ways he's part of the story of like Western philosophy. I mean, obviously the word Western here is very problematic to apply, but he's reading Aristotle in Arabic translation. He's thinking a lot about Aristotle and commenting on him. Um, so I guess I don't find, I mean, obviously I'm very close to it. So to me, it's not at all surprising that there'd be this field of study of Islamic philosophy. It is, however, very surprising that I wound up doing it
Right.
because I
Right.
have no personal connection to Islam or the Arabic language. So, I mean, just to make a long story short, because I've told this story elsewhere quite a few times, um, basically what happened was that I went to graduate school and I went to the University of Notre Dame intending to be a specialist in Latin medieval philosophy. And the reason I wanted to do that is basically that I wanted to work on an area of the history of philosophy where there was still a lot to be done. And I didn't know that much about what there had been done. I mean, I had only just gotten my undergraduate degree, right? And also bear in mind, this was 1994, so we're before the internet. So I couldn't like get access to lots and lots of information about the history of philosophy beyond what was in the library of my undergraduate college, which is Williams College. And so I kind of knew there was Latin medieval philosophy, and it seemed like there was a lot less exploration of that than, let's say, Plato and Aristotle, who I was really interested in. And I thought, oh, this would be good because I could kind of keep thinking about Plato and Aristotle and their reception in Latin. So that made sense. So I went off and went to Notre Dame to get a PhD there because they were strong in medieval. But then I kind of had this thought already, even when I was applying for graduate school, that if I learned Arabic, that would give me access to this whole other body of medieval philosophy. And I also at least knew at the time that there was this kind of interplay between Greek philosophy, Arabic philosophy, and Latin philosophy, and that there might be something to do there, like studying the interchange between those three cultures. And that was a good intuition on my part as a young person who didn't know what they were doing, because that is exactly what I wound up doing. I mean, I've done more on the Greek Arabic transmission than the Arabic Latin transmission, but I have done stuff on all three languages. So that's really how I got into it.
So most philosophers of ancient or medieval philosophy, as far as I can tell, they probably know Greek. They also probably know at least some Latin, and then maybe some German or French. What languages have you studied?
Oh, well, so I started out doing, I mean, Spanish actually was my first foreign language. So I did that in high school. And when I was 18, I was really good in Spanish. So it's completely gone now. I mean, I can read Spanish still quite well because I learned it when I was so young. But when I was 18, I had conversational Spanish. And actually, the only languages I've ever gotten to be good enough at conversationally that I could speak, like have a conversation, have been Spanish and German. I mean, obviously English, but those are the only foreign languages I've mastered as living languages. So so I had Spanish when I got to college, and I learned Latin while I was in college, and then I studied Greek and Arabic while I was in grad school, and I learned to read French and Italian around then, also just to be able to read the secondary literature. And then I had the good fortune in many, many ways of meeting my wife to be, who's German. So that's how I wound up becoming fluent in German. So, I mean, I really have German as a second language. I teach in German and, have lots of friendships in German and so on. So that's like the only foreign language I really know, to be honest. But I can read the languages I've mentioned. Plus, a few years ago, I started studying Persian with one of my team members here who's from Iran. So he's been teaching.
Is that the same as Farsi?
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Although I think Farsi is a word people tend to use more for like modern Persian, and we're reading medieval Persian philosophical texts. So I think that's about it. I have just started taking a Sanskrit course with the ambition of eventually being able to fight my way through Sanskrit text if I had a translation. I don't really think I'm ever going to get beyond that. Sanskrit turns out to be extremely hard. So like, if anyone's watching this who's studied ancient Greek, imagine ancient Greek. You've got all of the things that's hard about ancient Greek. Plus, there's a few other things that make it additionally hard.
Well, wait, let's talk about it. So ancient Greek, I mean, I think of, you've got a different alphabet, you've got aspirations, which I found kind of difficult, and then you've got accents, you have all of these different cases and grammatical issues. What makes Sanskrit more difficult? Is it right to left?
No, it's left to right. Although, to be honest, that's not a big problem.
Okay.
Reading
I found it confusing with Hebrew. I tried to learn Hebrew, and I found that difficult.
Hebrew is like my great missed. I mean, that's the language I really feel like I should have learned, that or Syriac as well, because Syriac, Syriac was a language in which a lot of philosophy was done in the medieval period, and it's kind of a bridging language between Greek and Arabic and the Near East. But anyway, I mean, you're definitely asking the wrong person, because as I say, I've only been doing like a once a week Sanskrit course for a few months, but it's Indo-Germanic, right? So it has a lot of the same structures as Latin and Greek. And in fact, something that really blew me away early on looking through the grammar book we have for the course is there's a list of prepositions, and it looks like the Greek prepositions, like all the basically all the same prepositions are there, or near spellings of them. So you can really, really tell it's a related language. So it has a lot, like you said, the case endings, the way the verbs work, where there's like a part of the verb, and then you kind of modify it to get the different tenses and so on. So all of that kind of heavy, heavy grammar that you don't have in English, but you do have in Latin and Greek, that's all there in Sanskrit. But the thing that makes Sanskrit really a pain, as far as I can tell, first of all, the script is incredibly difficult. It's much harder than the Arabic script. There's just a lot more kind of different ways things are written, because when letters combine, you get a different way of writing it. And then there's a similar thing in pronunciation, where if two letters get close to each other, one of them or both of them will change. So
That's tricky.
An S before certain letters becomes an H, because they don't like saying like sissa, so they say hus, right? That kind of thing. And this, in most languages, this is just something that you do in pronunciation. Like, for example, I just said the sentence, in most languages, is something you do in pronunciation, as if duin were one word, right? But we don't write duin when it's do and then in. So it's not like we have the word do, and then we turn the O of do into a U before an I. But in Sanskrit, they do that. So they have like completely faithful way of writing the letters to map the way the letters change when they kind of glue to other letters. And that's called sandhi. And there's like dozens and dozens of these rules that you're supposed to know. And if you want to even recognize what case something is, you have to know all these rules, because you have to know that it actually ended with an S. So it's nominative or whatever, but now it's an H because it changed before this next letter, right? And so it's like, whoa, man, this is really hard. I really think at my age, and given how much time I have, probably the best I'll get to is where I can, like I say, sort of like take a translation and a text and actually at least be able to see what the Sanskrit words are that are being translated. But I doubt I'll get to the point where I could like second guess the translation or whatever. Whereas with Persian, I was able to do that pretty quickly, like within just a few years, because there's so much overlap between Persian and philosophical Arabic.
I like the language conversation. I like languages a lot. I found them interesting. Is it okay if I ask a couple more questions about it?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
What languages have you learned, if I may ask?
Well, I like to say that I only speak English. That's all I really speak.
Yeah, exactly.
But I have studied like 11 or 12 to various degrees. Awesome. But I only ever really spoke maybe 4 of them: French, Spanish, Italian, Polish, and then I dated a Hungarian girl for a while. Hi, Sharo, if you're listening somehow. And I spoke a little bit of Hungarian for a bit, but
yeah, that is next level. Hungarian's supposedly really, really hard, right?
Hungarian is tough. I still use a few words. Tsitsa is kitten, so I call her my Tsitsa. But so I did like a semester of Greek, a semester of Latin, and German, and some other ones. But you said that your only living languages are Spanish and German, but you clearly know a lot of Arabic. Is the Arabic you know like ancient or medieval Arabic, and it's just quite different from today's Arabic?
Yeah. That's a complicated issue. So there's something that we call classical Arabic, which is what we're reading all the time when we read medieval philosophical texts, right? And something that people say, so I'm not enough of a linguist to be able to guarantee that this is true, but people say that the Quran stabilized the written language of Arabic. So once you have the Quran and everyone's learning the Quran and to recite it and so on, you can't change the grammar anymore of proper like Arabic. And so that means that actually so what I did when I learned Arabic is I took a course on what's called Modern Standard Arabic. At least that's what the textbook was called. And the rules I was learning there are all completely applicable to medieval philosophy. So like Avicenna is writing grammatically from a grammatical point of view, what you learn in a course on standard Arabic is applicable to Avicenna. What you're not learning there is like what all the words would mean. So, I mean, I've actually had the experience of reading texts by authors like Avicenna with native Arabic speakers, and they can, they understand the grammar and everything beautifully. They can read it out beautifully, much better than I can with my terrible accent and so on. But they will only know what it means if they've studied philosophy, right? Just like, you can't throw Kant in German at a German and have them make sense of it, right? It's the same thing. So but the wrinkle is that there's a big gap between this like proper written Arabic and what people actually speak in different Arabic speaking countries. So there's something called Fusha, which is like standard high Arabic, sort of like the concept of Hochdeutsch in German, High German, but with the exception that there are some people who claim to speak Hochdeutsch, High German, whereas basically nobody speaks Fusha. So it would be, a comparison I've heard is that it would be like sort of turning up and starting to speak in Shakespearean English.
Okay.
So it's just not a way people talk. But if you watch maybe things like news reports, then you'd be hearing an Arabic that's a lot closer to that than what you might hear on the streets. So it's quite a fluid situation. And in a way, actually, one reason that I've never really learned to, I mean, lots of reasons why I never have managed to get conversational Arabic. But one big reason is the distance between, let's say, Egyptian Arabic, which is an obvious kind of Arabic to learn. There's a pretty big gap between that and like the kind of Arabic that I'm actually using in my work. So, I mean, I still kind of dream of doing it, like going to live in Egypt or something for 2 years and learning Arabic properly. Maybe I'll do that when I retire or something. It's better late than never. But
okay.
There is a difference between like, proper written. There's a difference between classical Arabic and proper written Arabic now. And then there's another difference between proper written Arabic and dialect.
Okay. My last language question. I'm always interested in etymology, and I'm only recalling right now that maybe a couple years ago I was writing and thinking about the number zero, and the number zero, or well, our word for zero has its roots, I think, in maybe Al-Khwarizmi, or is it somebody brought the Arabic numerals over to English, but it's something like Sifra, or it comes from something like that.
Okay, interesting. I don't know the etymology of the word zero. There's a comparable thing, which is the word algebra.
Right.
And you can actually see in the word algebra that it's from Arabic because the al is just the definite article. So it's the in Arabic is al.
Oh, I found it actually.
Oh, great. So what is the answer?
Zero,
okay.
It comes from via Old Spanish from Arabic, cipher.
Wow. Okay. Amazing. Because it's like it stands in for a place, right? So that's why it's
right. It's a placeholder. Yeah. In a positional notation system.
Zero from India. So actually, my colleague Charles Burnett in London has done some work on this, the sort of history of zero.
Okay. I've probably read something that he wrote.
You should interview him. He's great, actually.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
So, yeah, what I was just going to say is that, like, so there's a lot of words that begin with al, like alchemy and algebra, and those often come from Arabic. So algebra it's the word there is actually jibra. It's not algebra, and so it's the calculation, right, or whatever jibra means in this context. So algebra. And then we get the word algebra, and the definite article has just stayed in the word. Actually, my favorite example of this is alchemy, because kimia is a Greek word, which was then transliterated into Arabic, alchimia, and then they take it over into Spanish or whatever as alchemy.
Okay, that's actually what I was going to ask next. What one of your favorite ones was? Okay, so perfect. Okay, now the main reason we're here, now that you
philosophy,
satisfied
done language all night, actually.
My language interest, yeah. But so when we talk about Islamic philosophy, are we talking about really the philosophy of the religion, or is it philosophy done by a specific culture or specific to a region or a time period, or I mean a way of doing philosophy? what is it that you have in mind when you say, or your AOS is Islamic philosophy?
Yeah, right. Actually, you're already touching on a very controversial question there, as it turns out. So when I first came into the field, there was a lot of debate about what to call it. There was an ongoing kind of fight between people who wanted to call it Arabic philosophy and people who wanted to call it Islamic philosophy.
Oh, interesting.
And there were good arguments on both sides. So the point of calling it Arabic philosophy is that you're highlighting the fact that it's a philosophical tradition that grows out of a translation movement from Greek into Arabic, right? And so it tended to be adopted by people who were more interested in the reception of Greek thought in the Arabic speaking worlds, whereas people who used Islamic philosophy tended to be a little bit more interested in where philosophy went after Avicenna, and maybe we're not so interested in the Greek Arabic translations, and we're more interested in the way that philosophy was interacting with religious issues, so hence Islamic, right? But as I say, there were good arguments. So there were good motivations on both sides, because both of those are, I think, perfectly respectable approaches. But so one thing you can complain about with Arabic is an obvious thing, which is that some of the philosophy was written in these other languages we were talking about, like Persian and Syriac. And similarly, calling it Islamic philosophy is problematic because a lot of the philosophy that was done in these cultures was done by Jews, and some of it was done by Christians. So I actually am really interested in a group of philosophers who worked in the 10th century in Baghdad, who we call the Baghdad School or the Baghdad Aristotelians. And they included Al-Farabi, who's one of the most famous Muslim philosophers, but the rest of them were all Christians. So they're living in the 10th century in Baghdad, and they're all Christians reading Aristotle. And it's like obvious that they would need to be considered as part of the story of whatever this is that we're doing, right? And it's absurd to call them as Islamic philosophers, right? Because they're not even Muslims. Mm-hmm. So I actually, I wouldn't claim to have thought of this myself. I don't really know where I got this formulation, but I eventually adopted the practice of calling it philosophy in the Islamic world, which seems to have kind of come in as a kind of negotiated settlements, because everyone can kind of live with that to some extent. So I wouldn't say that everybody in the field uses it now, but it's quite common, even though it's a bit clunky, right? Philosophy in the Islamic world. And so what that would mean is philosophy that's being done in geographical regions, historical periods where Islam is culturally or politically dominant. So you're basically talking about the realm of the Muslim conquests after the rise of Islam. So Islam begins in the 7th century, and then it very quickly spreads as the dominant religion from obviously like Andalusia in the far west and all the way to Central Asia in the east. So we're talking about philosophy that's done there, and then in the cultures that kind of follow on from that, so all the way down to the present day. So I would consider, philosophy being done now in Egypt, let's say, as part of philosophy in the Islamic world, even though I'm a specialist on pre-modern philosophy in the Islamic world.
Right. I mean, speaking of Egypt, one of the reasons that question it came to me was that I know that the Arab world has contributed immensely to science. And so I was wondering about Islamic philosophy of science. And as I was thinking about questions I could ask you, Ptolemy was the first name that came to mind, but then I thought, well, he's pre-Islam. So is that, even though he's in Egypt, or he was an Egyptian, does that count as Islamic philosophy? Is that something worth talking about? So that's just where the question came from.
Yeah, I would say no. So, so Plotinus, so one of my favorite philosophers, the founder of Neoplatonism, he was from Egypt, or Augustine is from modern day Tunisia. So these are places that eventually became Muslim, but of course they weren't. They lived centuries before Islam arose. So I don't think you can call that the Islamic world. You can call it Africa, right? So, I've done with G.K. Jeffers, my co-author for the series on Africana philosophy. When we were doing that series in my podcast, one of the questions that arose is like, what should we do about figures like Augustine, who are from Africa? right? Because Africa is kind of a permanent feature of the globe, right? Unlike Islam. And but of course, in a way, it's similar, right? So the Islamic world is a geographical designation, and so is Africa. It's just that Africa is like permanently there, and the Islamic world isn't. And actually, we're kind of just able to avoid that question because the Northern African thinkers of late antiquity were people I had covered anyway earlier in the podcast, so we didn't have to cover them again. And we kind of said, well, you could, but we were not going to because I already did, right? By the way, it's interesting you asked about Ptolemy because I just had a PhD student who did a really brilliant dissertation that he finished. I guess he finished earlier this year, and he's starting a postdoc with me now. And he did a dissertation on the reception of Ptolemy in Arabic. So in the Islamic world, they were reading Ptolemy, but Ptolemy is too early to count as a figure from the Islamic world, in my opinion. It's just so another expression that I use a lot is Latin Christendom. So what does that mean? Well, Latin Christendom would be like so Latin Christian philosophy, or the philosophy of Latin Christendom, would be basically philosophy in the medieval period and up to the Renaissance, when they're as long as they're writing in Latin. But in the 17th century, 18th century, they're still writing in Latin. And it kind of gets phased out and they move over to the vernaculars eventually. And to me, that's like a very similar thought. So you're thinking about a kind of geographical, political, cultural space, and then you're interested in all the philosophy that's happening there. And it doesn't matter whether it's being done by scholastics or mystics, men or women, Protestants or Catholics, right? It's all kind of a thing. And of course, these things overlap, right? So you could think about, so a good example is that philosophy in the Islamic world overlaps with African philosophy, and it also overlaps with European philosophy. So because, of course, for a long time, Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, was under Islamic dominion. So a figure like Ibn Rushd, who's usually called Averroes in English, so he's one of the most important philosophers from the Islamic world, great commentator on Aristotle. And he lives in Europe, right? He lives in Spain. As I always like to say, he lives further west than Thomas Aquinas did. So if you contrast like Western philosophy to Islamic philosophy, that doesn't really make any sense because Spain is really far west, right? So you can kind of cut up the pie however you want, in a sense. I mean, I guess some divisions would be more justifiable than others, but I'm not someone who thinks that there's like one right way to divide up the history of philosophy. So, for example, you could do Arabic philosophy and say, well, I do philosophy that's written in Arabic. That'd be fine. I wouldn't have anything against that. But it would be a little bit weird because you'd wind up sort of artificially saying, well, if these philosophers are doing almost exactly the same thing, reading about the same text, thinking about the same problems, if they start writing in Persian, I'm no longer doing that, right? And that doesn't seem very principled to me. So that's why I prefer philosophy in the Islamic world.
When I first started taking ancient philosophy courses, it was with Katya Vogt at Columbia. And I was very surprised because I had expected that Zeus, Athena, all of these people would be playing a huge role in ancient philosophy. And I was astonished to find no mention of them. And as you've talked briefly thus far about Islamic philosophy, you've mentioned Aristotle, Plotinus, Ptolemy, or I guess I mentioned Ptolemy, but you haven't mentioned the Quran. Well, you mentioned the Quran in the context of our discussion about language, but is the Quran not a central element of philosophy in the Islamic world? Or
right, that's a great question. So there it depends a little bit on what you mean by philosophy. So there's kind of two views people have on this nowadays. One is a more strict view, let's say, where philosophy basically winds up being an engagement with Greek translations, or the translations from Greek into Arabic. So you're thinking about basically Aristotelianism, and you're thinking about stuff that's secular and kind of has on its face that it's from another culture because it comes out of this translation movement. So that's and one reason to think about it like that is that there's a word in Arabic which is falsafa, which referred to that. So when they talk about people doing falsafa, so the people who did that are called falasifa. So the people who are called falasifa are usually people who are engaged with Aristotle, or who then are engaged with Avicenna and following him because Avicenna was perceived as a follower of Aristotle. So there's a kind of through line from the Greek translations through Avicenna, through Avicenna's legacy.
And are you going to contrast this then with theology or
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
So what I was going to and then what that approach would want to exclude is primarily what we call kalam, and kalam, that's a kind of weird word. So it actually means word. And
is it KALAM?
Right, with a long
Okay.
second A. So a line over the second A if you're being persnickety. So kalam is often translated as theology, and the kind of more I don't know what the right word would be, perhaps open-minded or less picky version of what philosophy in the Islamic world could be is that we're going to take anything that looks like philosophy or deals with philosophical issues as we would kind of think about philosophical issues today in a serious way. We're going to think about that as philosophy. So because in Kalam you have things like proofs for the existence of God, what are the standards for moral responsibility, the free will problem, which is connected to moral responsibility, atomism, theories of substance, theories of being, theories of creation, you even like philosophy of language, they get into all of these things, right? But at the same time, they're thinking a lot about the Quran and also the Hadith, the things that are ascribed to the Prophet as things that he said and did. So there you have like a very explicit engagement with religious sources, even though they're also dealing with philosophical issues a lot of the time. So this is comparable to what we find in Latin Christendom, which I mentioned before, with, let's say, scholastic theology. So people like Aquinas, Duns Scotus, William of Ockham, they are theologians. In fact, they're even in theology faculties at universities. They're not in philosophy faculties, not that that existed, but they're not in the liberal arts faculties. Most medieval philosophers weren't. And the most famous ones were all in theology faculties. So I'm in this more promiscuous view, to put it in a more pejorative way. So my view is, look, if it looks like philosophy, then we should work on it as historians of philosophy, especially because the line between these two things tends to get quite blurry. So people often say that it got blurry after Avicenna, that because all of the theologians were reading Avicenna, they started like doing kalam and falsafa at the same time, or kind of weaving them together. And that was an observation that was even made in the medieval period. Like the historian Ibn Khaldun says, oh, after Ibn Sina, all the theologians started trying to do philosophy, and it was kind of got mixed together in a jumble. And sometimes people lament this, but I think it's really interesting, and that a lot of really brilliant philosophy was done in that context. And B, I also think it was something that was going on the whole time. So I think it was something Avicenna himself was doing. He was thinking a lot about Kalam and what they were up to, and he was responding to them. And I think pretty much all of the philosophers were always doing that. And I think they had to, actually, because in terms of like what was more culturally dominant, falsafa, this engagement with Greek sources, was a very narrow, small undertaking. So we're talking about maybe a couple hundred people over the course of several centuries, right? In the entire Islamic world, those are the people who are doing like really serious engagement with Aristotle. And the theologians were very, very numerous. So that was like the dominant intellectual tradition for thinking about philosophical problems in Islam. And then the philosophers, the people who were doing this Greek inspired stuff, kind of came in from the edge and said, well, actually, we've got some material that might help with some of your problems. And I think that it would have remained very marginal, except that Avicenna turned out to be like one of the most powerful thinkers who's ever lived. So he's absolutely on a level with like Aristotle, Kant, Confucius. He's like way up there in terms of being one of the most important, influential, brilliant philosophers who's ever lived. And so once he happens, everyone has to kind of come to grips with that, including the theologians. And that's how this Greek-inspired philosophy kind of came into the mainstream in a way, the mainstream being theology.
Okay, my last sort of broad question, as I just try to grapple with what Islamic philosophy is so it seems like on the one hand you have this group, the philosopher, who are mainly, I don't say this pejoratively, but treading old waters, in that they're rereading and rethinking about the ancients. And then you have the Kalam, who are working on more Islam-oriented problems.
Yep.
Are there problems that they discuss that are unique or particular to Islam that you don't find elsewhere? So one thing that comes to mind is, I've mentioned this a couple of times because I just found it so fascinating. I was talking to Barry Lamb, who has the podcast Hi-Fi Nation.
Hi-Fi Nation, and one of my favorite podcasts, actually.
Yeah, it's a really great show. So
amazing.
Yeah. And we were talking about the medieval metaphysical problem of cannibalism and resurrection, which was only to my mind
that thing about cannibalism, in his podcast, right?
Yeah, it was only as far as I'm aware. I mean, that's just a problem that's specific to Christian theology, and I'm wondering if there are analogs, maybe not about cannibalism, but that just have to do with quote unquote Islamic or theological world building.
Yeah, right. That's a good word, good phrase. Yeah. So I think you would find some things that are quite distinctive to Islam, but not unique, because there's so much overlap between Judaism and Islam. So, and also Christianity to some extent. So something you get a lot about in Islamic philosophy, especially if you are willing to count Kalam as part of Islamic philosophy, is reflection on things like divine attributes and also prophecy. So
I'd love to talk about prophecy.
Like a really driving force for all Muslim thinkers, including the philosopher, actually, is what in Arabic is called tawheed, which means oneness or unity. So the point here is that Islam has this distinctive commitment to the unity of God, i.e., usually is understood as the uniqueness of God, right? So what you say when you kind of endorse Islam is there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, right? So both sides of that statement raise philosophical issues. So the first set of issues is about the oneness of God, the uniqueness of God, and it's often interpreted both in falsafa and kalam as requiring not just that God is unique, like there's no second or third God, but also that God is simple, so God has no parts, right? And they think that Christianity is violating that by endorsing the Trinity. So in Christianity, you also have debate. You also have an idea about the simplicity of God, but except for Unitarians who come along later, the simplicity of God is then always understood as being somehow compatible with the Trinity. And listeners can write in and tell us how they think that's supposed to work. But the Muslims and the Jews think that doesn't work at all. So they think this is clearly wrong. This is either a commitment to three gods or it doesn't mean anything at all. And we only have one God, unlike you Christians with your three gods, right? So they would put that sort of polemically. And so they spend a lot of time trying to safeguard God's unity against threats to unity. So in particular, they're quite worried about the problem that the various descriptions of God would somehow imply multiplicity. Like if you say he's powerful, wise, and knowledgeable, that sounds like there's three features in God, and so that might undermine his unity. So you get a lot of focus on that in Islam, but also in Judaism, like Maimonides, the great Jewish thinker, was very interested in that. And then the second part of the statement, there is no God but God, Muhammad is his prophet, is prophecy. So how does that work? And then you get a lot of philosophical reflection on the nature of prophecy. What kind of knowledge is it? What do prophets know that other people can't know, if anything, etc. And again, you get a lot of reflection on that in Judaism as well, because of course there's the prophets from the Old Testament that they have to think about, and Moses is the central example of a prophet for them, not Muhammad. But so there's a lot in common, but there's a lot of discussion of those two issues that you wouldn't find in, let's say, I don't know, like Chinese philosophy, perhaps. And then there's some other things like philosophical issues that arise revolving around law, because both Islam and Judaism are very legalistic traditions. So yeah, I think also creation, right? So the fact that God is a creator of the universe is why they get so interested in the eternity of the universe. The Aristotelians say the universe is eternal. Theologians say that it isn't. So that becomes a debating point. So I'm not sure I'm coming up with an example of anything that's like absolutely unique, but there's definitely some philosophical things that they gravitate towards because they're in an Islamic context. And then some of those things are shared with Christians and or Jews, especially Jews. But bear in mind, a lot of medieval Jewish philosophers are working in the Islamic world anyway, so they're talking to each other.
All four of those are very fascinating to me. So taking the issue with the Trinity and the multiplicity, I'm just curious, is that, or has that led, or did it lead to some of the animosity between the Islamic world and the Christian world? Was that a motivating force? Because I know that, or I think I know that back in the day, worshiping false idols was a real big no-no.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, so the standard, of course, there are exceptions, right? So there are moments of less acceptance and moments of greater acceptance, but the standard position in Islamic history is that Jews and Christians are so-called peoples of the book, meaning that they've received a genuine revelation, which has been superseded by the Islamic revelation. So the Jews and Christians are doing very badly by not believing in Muhammad as a prophet, right? But they're doing well because they also believe in their own revealed texts and their own prophets. So the Muslims think that Jesus was a prophet and that he was genuinely bringing a revelation from God. They don't think that Jesus was God, obviously. So they think that Christians have kind of gotten confused about the nature of Jesus and his mission. So there's a lot of problems with Christianity from their point of view, but they still think that Christians are fundamentally not, for example, idol worshippers or something like really bad. They're not pagans. They're basically confused monotheists who should be brought to accept Islam. And so what you'll see there is much more like, I mean, at the level of intellectual activity, what you see is a lot of interreligious debate, sometimes actually using philosophy. So, for example, there are interesting texts which basically say things like, well, if you use Aristotelian logic correctly, you would see that the Trinity can't possibly be true. And then the Christians come back and say, no, if you study Aristotle's logic, you'll see that it gives you exactly the tools for understanding the Trinity, right? And it sort of goes back and forth. Whereas, but still, like, it's seen as a kind of a debate within a broader monotheistic context where everyone kind of agrees about the ground rules. Like, we're all believing in one God who created the universe, omnipotent God, omniscient, right? So it's much different than if you were arguing with polytheists, for example. Because, I mean, imagine the Christians said, oh, yeah, we believe in three gods, right? Then the Muslims would say, "What? Hold on a second. Like, you're not even monotheists anymore."
Right,
that's
right.
completely different. But that's not what the Christians said. The Christians said, hey, we are monotheists. We believe in one God who's three persons, but not three gods. And the Muslims would say, we don't understand what you mean by that.
You're
And the
just
Christian said,
confused.
well, we don't fully understand what we mean by that either, but here's our best way of explaining it, right? So that's kind of how it goes. Now, that's all at the level of intellectual debate, and it kind of explains why Jews and Christians were able to live within Islamic geographical spaces in a way that, for example, Jews and Muslims were much less able to live in Christian geographical spaces. But having said that, of course, there's also a lot of political friction and outright warfare between various Islamic powers and various Christian powers during the Middle Ages, like, the Seljuks fighting with the Byzantines and so on. But even then, actually, we should bear in mind that sometimes you have things like Christians allying with Muslim armies against other Christians. So it's not like it always just cuts along religious lines either.
While we're talking about the Trinity and Christianity and Islam, I'm not Catholic, but I went to Catholic school as a kid, and I had to go to religion class, and I recall being taught that in the Eucharist, so communion, the wine you drink and the little wafers literally become the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. So there's some really crazy metaphysical change going on here. And I'm wondering is there anything, well, I really don't know much about Islam. I'm assuming that I know that they don't do the Eucharist, obviously, because they don't believe this. But are there, I guess, like metaphysical little puzzles like that? Like, how could this be happening? Or like, what is the metaphysical status for the theologians of the Quran? Like, is it something that is like written by humans? But I don't really have much more clear to say on this. It's just
No, that actually is a great question. So, in fact, your example of the Eucharist is a fabulous example of something that can give rise to a very distinctive and, in fact, in that case, unique set of philosophical issues. Like, how can something go from being bread to being the body of Christ without changing its appearance or its accidental properties, right? And so that's something that medieval scholastics thought about a lot. And
cool.
Actually, what I've been covering the Reformation more recently in my podcast, and that becomes one of the issues that both divides Catholics from Protestants and divides Protestants from Protestants. So one of the big things that they're fighting about amongst the Protestants is whether they should retain a broadly Catholic understanding of like a genuine metaphysical change, or whether the Eucharist is purely symbolic or whatever. Right.
And I'm guessing this is just happening among the theologians. I mean, commoners worrying about this?
The commoners are like going along to watch people burned to death in England for saying the wrong thing.
Okay. So they got some stake in the game.
They're doing things like dragging their priests out of the church and beating them half to death or all the way to death for doing the wrong thing. So no,
okay.
I mean, it was like, I would compare it to something like, so your view on the Eucharist in the 16th century would be like your view about how should we deal with the coronavirus now. Everyone has an opinion and there are specialists, but the non-specialists have an opinion too, right? And they might feel very, very strongly about it as well. But anyway, getting back to your very insightful question, actually, about the Quran, that was exactly the example I was going to give. So because Islam is a book-centered religion in a way that Judaism is with the Torah, but maybe even more so because it's complicated. It's hard to compare, but in rabbinical Judaism, there's this long oral tradition which constitutes a lot of the law, whereas Islam is really about the Quran and then the Hadith, which are just things that are handed down about things the Prophet said and did in his lifetime. So that's your basis for all religious claims. And of course, the Quran is said to be the word of God. And so now exactly the question you just raised becomes a central issue in Islamic theology, and again becomes very politically problematic. So something that happened in the 9th century, so just around the time that the Greek philosophical works were being translated into Arabic, there was an event called the Mihna, which means test or trial, where the Abbasid authorities, so the Caliph and his government, required all of the provincial governors and theologians to accept that the Quran is created and not eternal. The thought being that if the Quran was the idea, the contrary idea is maybe simpler to understand. So people said, well, the Quran is God's word, so it's eternal, right? Because God is eternal. So if he speaks, then whatever he says is eternal, right? And the contrary view was, well, eternity is something that's unique to God. And if you say the Quran is eternal, then it would be like positing a second God. That's polytheism. Or it might sound a little bit like the second person of the Trinity. So sometimes people thought about the second person of the Trinity being like God's ideas, or,
The Holy Spirit.
Well, that's the third person of the Trinity.
Okay,
so I was thinking of the Son as being like the logos of God. So logos means word, right? Proceeding from the mind of the Father. That's something that people sometimes say about the Trinity as a way of explaining it. And
interesting that logos and column are both word.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. The word turned out to be very important.
Yeah.
And so the people who wanted to say that the Quran is created said, well, we don't want anything like that. We just want this like austere, simple, completely transcendent, completely unified God. And then if he speaks, what that means is that he causes speech to exist in the world for us to hear. Here it might also be important to bear in mind that the Quran was really like the spoken words of the Quran in Arabic. It's not a book, like a physical book. It's the recitation. So actually, Quran means recitation, literally. So the way it was revealed is that an angel appeared to the Prophet Muhammad and said, Iqra, which means recite, like a command, recite, and then spoke to him, and then he had to say it. And that was his prophecy, right? So that was what was revealed to him, is what he recites. And so actually, technically speaking, the Quran in the first instance is the spoken words of the Quran, and they were passed down orally for a while before they were written down after Muhammad's death. So when we think of the Quran as like something you can pull off the shelf, but these theologians in the 9th century, I think, are really still thinking of it primarily as something that's spoken out loud, right? Also, remember, we're in a society here where most people are illiterate. So thinking about it primarily as a written phenomenon, it doesn't make that much sense anyway for them, perhaps. And so the question is like, what is the metaphysical status of this recitation of these words that God has revealed to us? And one thought was, well, it's just God creating it every time someone speaks it. That's why it's created. But another thought was, no, but it's God's word. So it's what he has to say, as it were. So it must be eternal, just like he is.
And they're touching on the type token distinction somehow.
That too. Yeah, absolutely. So is how many times is it created? So actually, that's exactly right. So if it's created, you probably think that it's created every time someone says it. Right. Whereas it's eternal. If it's eternal, there's just one.
And if you have two Qurans, do you have two Qurans or one Quran? Exactly. Do you have the same Quran in one hand as in the other hand, if it's eternal and singular in that way?
And of course, we could wonder that as philosophers too. Like if we have the word, I don't know, black, like written on a board, and then I'm saying it out loud, is that the same word or two words? Well, in a way, it's the same word. In a way, it's two words, right? There's other wrinkles here. So a nice thing for philosophers to think about is that, for example, in the Quran, there are people named, like specific people named, who are basically damned by the Quran, and because these are opponents of Muhammad, and it says that they're going to hell. So not too surprising. But then imagine that you think the Quran is eternal. Well, that means that before this person was born, it was already kind of there in the Quran that they would be a sinner and that they would go to hell. And that might seem to undermine free will. And in fact, the people who were upholders of free will were often upholders of the createdness of the Quran, in part for this reason.
Yeah, that was the problem. I mean, of the four problems typical of Islam philosophy in the Islamic world, you mentioned prophecy as one of them. And I was wondering how prophecy related to free will and what some of the thought going on there was among the theologians.
Yeah, that is one of the reasons it comes. I mean, that's quite a technical, specific reason, although it's certainly something they were worried about. But a bigger reason that they're worried about free will, and this is something that the theologians worry about a lot in Kalam, is that God is the creator of everything, right? So that means that he's also the creator of our actions, apparently, right? So if let's say I hit someone in anger, well, the action of hitting in the metaphysical picture that is used in Kalam would require that this action has an agent, a cause for its existence. And although it might look like I'm the creator of my hitting, someone might have hesitation about saying that, because they might say that if I can create my act of hitting the person, then I'm infringing on God's omnipotence as the only creator. So it's actually God creating the act of hitting. So what is my role here? If I'm not producing or causing the act of hitting, is it that I'm deciding to hit the person? Well, decision is also like an event or an act. So it looks like God has to create my decision as well, right? So it looks like it's the more you take God's omnipotence and sole prerogative to be a creator seriously, the more it looks like there's nothing left for me to do. And if there's nothing at all left for me to do, it doesn't look like I'm morally responsible. So there's this big debate. This is actually one of the central debates in Kalam between different schools of Kalam.
And that probably goes into the legal philosophy as well.
Yeah, that's right. So although I think that in a way, this debate over free will is more like a discussion of the possibility of there even being legal requirements. So like so we know we're going to be, so these theologians often were lawyers as well. They're jurists. So they know very, very well that there's all these legal requirements and injunctions and commands and prohibitions and so on. So they've got that not just in the back of their mind, but in the front of their mind all the time. And they're wondering, well, why are these applicable to us, right? How can I be blamed for not carrying them out? Because if I'm not morally responsible or free, then if God's making me do everything, I'm like a puppet, then what is even the point of him revealing these requirements to me, right? What is the point of a law in a situation where nobody has any free will, right? So some people who are more of the upholders of free will say that it's just an exception. So God creates everything in the world, except that humans create their own actions. And other theologians said, no, that's not acceptable because you're infringing on God's power. And for sure, God could create your action, right? So I think a good thought here would be, even if I'm creating my action, God must have allowed me to do it. And so he's kind of implicated anyway, right? Because he's at least permitting it to happen. So what they said is that you, by choosing the action, you acquire more responsibility for it, even though it's God making it happen. So you're like, so this terminology of acquisition, the Arabic word is iktisab or just kasb, is supposed to like give all of the moral responsibility to the human agent without any of the causal power. And then their opponent said that makes no sense, right? Because how can you be morally responsible if you're not the cause? And then it goes on and on and on. And that debate is also something that the philosophers reflect on to some extent.
do the theologians come up with anything approaching really a convincing argument about the feeling we have of being free despite God making our decisions or
Well, so you mean the
causing
second
things
group,
for
right?
us?
Because the first group
Yeah,
say we are free, so that's their explanation.
right,
And
right.
the first
Sorry.
group, I think, would say that what you're experiencing there is the condition of acquiring the action, right? So you feel so. In fact, they drew a contrast. They said there's a contrast between like a morally significant act like hitting someone, and they give examples like shivering or having a convulsion. Or actually, I had the hiccups earlier today. I was worried that this wasn't going to work out, this interview, because I had the hiccups like all day. And then they stopped 20 minutes before we started the interview. I gargled water and then drank it really quickly. So that apparently works. So hiccuping or shivering or convulsing, these are actions, right, that aren't free. And these people who had the theory of acquisition would say, well, that so you can tell the difference, even though God is creating the shivering and God is creating the action of your hand when you hit someone. And the difference is precisely this difference of whether you're morally responsible, i.e., whether you've taken possession of the act as sort of like, yeah, that's my act, right? So I
Yeah.
stand behind it. I'm morally responsible for it. Another thing that you might think is going on here, if you're a philosopher, is that this is really a debate between incompatibilists and compatibilists, right? Because the first group think that if God is the causal determining agent, then that precludes that you're morally responsible or free. Whereas the second group says that that's not true. So you can be determined to do something by a causal story. And it could be, science, whatever physics says, but it could also be God, right? And when you're determined causally to do something, you even though that's the case, you can still be free and morally responsible with respect to it.
The distinction between the shivering and the hitting reminds me of that phrase, like necessity breeds creativity. I mean, when you have to find an explanation for something like this with very limited tools. You have to find like a really good or compelling example, and you kind of pull it out of nothing.
And I think people who think that Kalam isn't philosophy, in a way, that's their worry. So they kind of think the answers have already been decided in advance, and so any philosophical moves they're making are just kind of ad hoc or not. It's not like the result of some kind of open-ended inquiry, rational inquiry.
I see.
It's just like, can I justify my theological view? But actually, I don't really think it's because I think that people, even Aristotle does that, right? Like, so all philosophers kind of know the answer ahead of time most of the time. It's like moral philosophers, if they do their moral philosophy open-ended rational inquiry, and it's like, oh, look, I discovered that it's okay to kill innocent people for no reason. They wouldn't say, well, that's an amazing discovery, now I have to convince everyone that that's true. They would like go back and check their math, right? So I think there's always constraints and theoretical desiderata that you're trying to satisfy when you do philosophy. And maybe they're more so in the case of theology, they're coming from a religious context, and you might think that that makes a difference. My cat, as promised, is now here making a fuss. So would you like to see my cat?
Yes, very much.
Here's Pepper, who hates being picked up and held. So
I can tell he's already struggling. Well, it was nice to meet Pepper briefly.
Oops.
So you were just speaking about Aristotle, and then, or you mentioned him, and that brings us to the last of the four sort of problems typical of philosophy in the Islamic world, which is creation. And I think you mentioned and I might be wrong, correct me, the philosopher believed that the world was eternal. And I'm guessing that they're building off of Aristotle, who thought it had to be eternal because if it wasn't, then there would have to be like a cause before it began. But if began at a certain time. You couldn't have anything before it. And then you contrasted that with the Kalam philosophers who believe that the world isn't eternal. Is that somewhat accurate?
Yeah, that's basically right. I mean, or let's put it this way: that's what people would always tell you.
Okay.
Like that's what most
Then?
historians of philosophy would say.
Okay.
So actually, and that's what I would have said until maybe 5 years ago when I started thinking about this harder. Because actually, I've worked on some philosophers who would certainly have been called falasifa. So like Al-Kindi, who I wrote a book about, Abu Bakr al-Razi, who I also wrote a book about, Miskaway, who I've written numerous articles about. So these are people who were all thought of as philosopher. They were very interested in Aristotle, very interested in the Greek tradition, but they all denied the eternity of the universe. So I started thinking, like, hold on a second. If I did a head count of philosopher, would it really even be true that a majority of them believed in the eternity of the universe? And I decided the answer is no, actually. So especially if you start counting the Jewish and Christian philosopher. So like the Baghdad school, those people that I mentioned before, they're Christians, so of course they believe in the non-eternity of the universe. And Maimonides probably believed in the non-eternity of the universe. Saadia Khan, an earlier Jewish philosopher, definitely believed in the non-eternity of the universe. So actually, if you start thinking about like, well, hold on a second, who accepts the eternity of the universe? The main examples are actually Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd. And so the fact that people always assume the philosopher accept the eternity of the universe, I think has more to do with the fact that these three really famous guys who were like the most prominent philosopher, they were hardcore Aristotelians, and they agreed with Aristotle about this. But actually I think most sort of Greek inspired thinkers, if that's what you want to think about as philosopher, actually believe the universe isn't eternal and that they could somehow get around Aristotle's arguments. But having said that, it's still true that there is like this really famous clash between falsafa and kalam. And the most prominent example of this is that Ibn Sina, who of course is the most important philosopher, who's inspired by Greek texts, he definitely thought the universe was eternal for somewhat different reasons from Aristotle, but he still thought it. And then this famous theologian, Al-Ghazali, comes along and writes a work called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, Tahafut al-Falasifa, in which he's attacking Ibn Sina's view on this question, among other questions. But this is the one that gets the most attention in the work. So he's really, really opposed to Avicenna's eternalism, and he wants to uphold the createdness of the universe. So like if you take an undergraduate course that covers Islamic philosophy, you're almost bound to cover this. And so you would certainly come away from it with the somewhat misleading idea that all of the philosophers believed in the eternity of the universe and all of the theologians believed in the createdness of the universe. I think it's true that all the theologians did all believe in the createdness of the universe, or the non-eternal creation of the universe, perhaps would be better. And it's true that Avicenna did think that the universe is eternal, but it's not true that everyone who was doing philosophy believed that the universe was eternal.
So, what are some of the views or arguments of the philosopher, maybe Avicenna, for the eternity of the world that diverge from Aristotle's argument?
Yeah, so his whole reason for endorsing the eternity of the world really comes from a completely different set of concerns, and it's really about the nature of God and the contrast between God and everything else. So something that's really distinctive about Ibn Sina, sorry, I keep changing back and forth between calling him Ibn Sina and Avicenna because I kind of think we should call him Ibn Sina, but I want people to know who I'm talking about. So let's call him Ibn Sina. Okay, since that was his name. So Ibn Sina.
Wait, are you saying how could you say it more slowly with that pronunciation?
So it's Ibn Sina. So Ibn means son of. So Ibn Sina.
I see.
And then Avicenna is just how they transliterated that into Latin. Just like Ibn Rushd is Averroes. So Averroes is an attempt to say Ibn Rushd in Latin. And Avicenna is an attempt to say Ibn Sina in Latin. Okay, so Ibn Sina, something that's really distinctive about him is that he uses what we now call modal concepts as the core of his philosophical theology. So, and modal concepts are necessity, possibility, and impossibility, right? So he has a proof for the existence of God, which basically, we don't need to get into it because it's a bit complicated, but basically the idea is that we're going to establish that there's a necessary existent. So that's the philosophical way of accessing God, is that we show that there's a necessary existent and everything else is contingent or merely possible. So what that means is that everything else is such that it might by its own nature either exist or not exist, whereas God is something that by his nature must exist. So to put it the other way around, it's impossible that God not exist, right? So then he furthermore assumes that having proved that God exists because we proved that he's a necessary existence, anything that we can say about God has to be compatible with his necessity. So it can't be that God has necessary existence and then so has some other feature that's merely contingent, right? And he has an argument for this, which is that suppose that God had a further contingent feature. So let's say that God is like a fan of Arsenal Football Club. So as you can see, I'm an Arsenal fan, right? Mm-hmm. And then you think, okay, well, God really loves Arsenal, but he could have loved Tottenham Hotspur. Well, not that. That's
not them.
But he could have loved, let's say, Manchester United. No, that's also ridiculous. He could have loved. I'm trying to think of
Chelsea,
a football team I don't hate. Yeah, okay, Chelsea. I don't hate Chelsea too much. So he could have loved Chelsea, but he decided to love Arsenal. So now Avicenna would say, well, hold on a second. Why does he love Arsenal and not Chelsea? Or for that matter, why does he love Arsenal rather than hating Arsenal? There must be some reason for that. And a reason would be a cause. And the cause can't just be God, his own nature, because if God loves Arsenal by his own nature, then it wouldn't be possible for him not to love Arsenal, right? Because his own nature would guarantee that he loves Arsenal. So the cause of his loving Arsenal must be some extrinsic cause, which means that something else is exerting causation on God to make this contingent feature be realized.
But that can't be.
Love for Arsenal. And that can't be. Okay, so that's all just a way of showing that nothing about God can be contingent. Okay? So if we bought all of that, now if we go back to the eternity of the universe, which viewers may remember we were discussing a long time ago before I went into all that. So coming back to that, so now let's imagine that the universe is created in time, so it's not eternal. Well, that means that God is not creating it and then is creating it. So clearly his creating it is contingent, right? Because he might not do it or he might do it. In fact, he's done both. For a while he wasn't doing it, now he is, right? Even if you think, well, hang on a second, that's cheating because God is timeless and time only begins when God creates the universe. The mere fact that the universe isn't always there shows that it's contingent, and therefore that his creation of it is contingent. I'm going to close the door because my cat came in. So that means that the universe can begin only by being contingent. If God's act of creating it is contingent, then we have a contingent fact about God, and we don't want that, right? Because it would mean there was some extrinsic thing causing him to create, basically. And what's interesting is that Ghazali, who's very, very smart also, he sees all of that.
And wait, and this was the theologian that he was
exactly
speaking with.
The Incoherence, right? So he comes along and writes the Incoherence, and the reason he wants to attack Ibn Sina on this point is precisely because he wants to insist that God can have contingent features. So what he says is, you're right, Ibn Sina, that God necessarily exists, but you're not right that everything about God is necessary, because God also has a free will. So God can arbitrarily choose whether to create the universe at all, when to create it, he could have created it 5 minutes later, 5 minutes earlier, 5 billion years earlier. He can do whatever he wants. So he, I think, would see himself as trying to safeguard God's power of free will and in general his omnipotence against the kind of more constricted necessitarian God of Avicenna. And you can see that like that first, so that shows you that the Kalam people and the Falsafa people are thinking about the same issues, as we've been talking about a lot. But it also shows you that the things that get talked about in debates about God in Islamic philosophy, we're going to call it that, just as in Latin Christian philosophy, they raise all of these other philosophical concerns that aren't specifically religious. So here, like, we're thinking a lot about the nature of modality. What could be the case? What isn't the case? What is guaranteed by something's nature? So you get into essentialism. So there's a lot of metaphysics going on here.
Even as you were talking, I was thinking, oh, what would they do if they had modal logic and possible world semantics in their argument toolkit?
But in a way, actually, that all comes from Avicenna originally. So Avicenna's whole idea here, like this distinction between the contingent and the necessary, that found its way into Latin through the translations of Avicenna as Avicenna. And then people like Duns Scotus go further with that, further develop notions, the modal notions, and then eventually you get to Leibniz. So the kind of the tools that we work with now, possible worlds, for example, they absolutely go back to Avicenna.
That's very cool. I see why I mean, if you just have that, you're already one of the like most influential philosophers on contemporary metaphysics. Absolutely. Now, do the modal concerns, or I can't pronounce the theologian interlocutor's name, but the contingency of God, does that figure into his argument somehow for the world not being eternal contra Avicenna?
Yeah, I mean, I always think this is a little bit odd. So we're talking about Al-Ghazali's position, but this is also just the standard position in Kalam, because you might think, well, hold on a second. If God is omnipotent, what if he wanted to create an eternal universe? Couldn't he do it? Right? He can do everything he wants. So why can't he create an eternal universe? And so actually, I think the motivation for Ghazali and other like-minded thinkers is to preserve God's omnipotence. But it's not good enough to just say, well, God is omnipotent, therefore the universe is created with a first moment in time, because the response is so obviously, well, if he's omnipotent, then he could have created an eternal universe too. And how could we tell the difference, right? Like, the world's been here as long as we've been here, and we didn't see it being created. So it doesn't look like it's something you could solve empirically, the problem, although there are some debates about that as well. So what the proponents of creation do is they try to argue that there's some intrinsic impossibility about an infinity of time having already elapsed. So some of them, I think, just think it's intuitively obvious that can't happen. Like, how could you, so as it were, you start infinitely long ago, and then you wait to get to now. So you have to wait until an infinity finishes elapsing, and now we finally, like, infinity, and now we get to the current moment. That can't be right. Yeah. So that's a kind of intuition you might have, but they also have other arguments against the possibility. So they say things like, in the medieval cosmology, we have the different planets rotating around the Earth, right? And some of them go around the Earth faster than others, like the moon does it faster than Jupiter, for example. So I don't know what the real numbers are, but let's say that the moon goes around the Earth 30 times as often as Jupiter does, right? So now let's imagine that the universe has already existed for an infinite amount of time. So that means that Jupiter has gone around the Earth an infinite number of times, and the moon has as well, but the number of rotations the moon has performed is 30 times larger than the number that Jupiter has performed. So we have two infinities like the infinity, which is the number of Jupiter's rotations, and infinity times 30, which is the number of the moon's rotations. And in their mathematics, that's not possible. So they would say, well, that's absurd, right? How could one infinity be larger than another? That's silly.
They hadn't read Cantor.
Exactly. Yeah. So that would be one kind of argument. They would also say things like the Aristotelians themselves would rule out that you can have an actual infinity. So the Aristotelians would say that you can always have potential infinities. Like I can count up without reaching a limit. 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't ever get to a limit. But what I can't have is an actual infinity of things all at the same time. That's ruled out in Aristotelian metaphysics. And so they make clever moves like saying, well, how many souls are there? Because we all agree that the souls of humans are immortal. If the universe is eternal, then the number of humans that have already existed is infinite. And their bodies are all gone, but their souls are still here. So we have an infinity of immortal souls sort of hanging around, and you guys don't like that. So
I'm catching a whiff of cannibalism right here.
Yeah, quite right. By the way, we're going to say before, Muslims could have that worry too, right? Because they do believe in the resurrection of the body.
Okay.
But I don't remember ever seeing a medieval Islamic discussion of that cannibalism problem. If anyone knows, tell me.
Yeah. Ooh. Does the Bible, or the Old Testament at least, have a similar metaphysical status to the Koran? Because I would just assume that because in the Bible it says God created the world at a specific time, it took 7 days, the theologians could just point to that as being the truth, and the universe began at a certain time.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly plenty of stuff in the Quran anyway about God creating the universe.
Okay.
So, and if anything, I mean, a kind of surprising historical fact is that it's really only in late antiquity that Jews and Christians start thinking about God as having created the universe from nothing with a first moment of time. So, I mean, if you sort of think like kind of intuitively about the book of Genesis, okay, that's about God creating the universe. But it doesn't say that God created the universe from nothing. And in fact, you might think it looks like it's saying that God created the universe out of some kind of primordial stuff. And in fact, that seems to have been quite a common view in ancient Judaism. So I don't think that the Old Testament, or the book of Genesis in particular, or the Quran absolutely predetermine the question one way or another. And even if they did, there's a lot of leeway about interpretation, right? So you can always make these sort of familiar moves, like these books were revealed for common believers and not for like highfalutin intellectual experts like us. So we know that the real meaning is that God is continually creating the universe eternally. So, I mean, bear in mind, Messina does think that God is the cause of the universe at all times, right? So he thinks that God is holding the universe in existence, and he thinks that's what real causation is, actually. So, I mean, I think he would say that the Kalam view, where what God does is sort of come along and create a universe all of a sudden, is a kind of naive idea about what creation should be, because real causation is bestowing existence on something. And so God's doing that all the time anyway, from moment to moment, as the theologians also said. And so I think Ibn Sina would say, well, why do you need to have had this start at some point? If God's doing it all the time, then he's the creator of the universe always. So the eternal universe is eternally dependent on him. And that's the way that he causes the universe. It's not that it's just like independent of him. It's totally dependent on him, but it's eternal. Whereas the theologians, for I think no good reason from his point of view, are saying, no, it's not only that it's dependent on him, it also depended on him and started to be dependent on him, because before that it didn't exist. Because they think that creation should mean bringing something to exist from not existing. And he says, I just don't think that's how the word has to be used. I had lost track of your question. I'm not sure if
No, I think you did. That reminds me of, I mean, Aristotle's Physics 1 and his uh
Yeah,
his arguments with the Eleatics about
absolutely.
sort of
Yeah.
coming into being and out of being.
Yeah.
But so we've talked about Ibn Sina. Was that roughly how it's supposed to sound? Okay. About Ibn Sina a fair amount. And you've described him as, I mean, the most influential of all the medieval philosophers.
Mhm.
One thing I've seen, so I'm still in your podcast. I mean, I think it must be listened to. I'm going chronologically, and I'm just finishing up with Aristotle right now. But
You've got a long way to go, man.
yeah, I've got a long way to go. I looked ahead and saw that there's an episode on Ibn Sina's flying man argument.
Yeah.
And I'm gathering that because you devoted a whole episode to that, you're a fan of whatever it is, because I don't know what it is.
Absolutely.
What
That's
is
brilliant.
the flying man argument?
Yeah. Okay. So, by the way, I should say that in my opinion, the podcast sort of hit its stride maybe around the time I was doing Aristotle, but I think it kind of gets better as it goes along. So it's good that you like it at the start, but it actually gets better as it kind of moves on into late antiquity.
Yeah,
It
I
certainly
mean,
gets a lot more detailed,
okay,
a
cool.
lot more complete, as it were, even though I was always calling it philosophy without any gaps, or history of philosophy without any gaps. It's more gappy at the beginning than it gets later on.
Yeah, well, this
Anyway,
whole podcast business is a learning curve,
it
big
is
time.
absolutely, and I think this is quite common for podcasters are always saying, "Oh, my first 15, 20 episodes are terrible. Yeah, I really hit my stride."
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so yeah, the flying man arguments. It is indeed a brilliant thought experiment. So the idea is that we want to show that the soul is not dependent on the body and is not in fact a body. So
Why do we want to show that? What's the motivation for this?
because, well, Ibn Sina would say because it's true.
That's a good
The
reason.
immediate context is that he's been criticizing Aristotle's definition of the soul as the form of the body. And he says that although you can see why Aristotle would have said that, because the soul does give powers and determination to the body. So the soul is like what animates the body, but it's not the form of the body because it could survive without the body, right? Whereas the form of something doesn't usually survive without the matter that it's giving form to, right? So if you think about the form of a table, let's say, if you smash the table, then so the table is destroyed, the form's gone as well, right? And he doesn't want it to be the case that if you die, then your soul dies. So your soul, he's going to later on prove that the soul is a self-subsisting substance and all the rest of it, right? So it's kind of a broadly dualist theory of soul that he's got. And he wants to kind of start warming you up for accepting this. So he has a thought experiment designed to help you see that this must be the case. And the thought experiment goes as follows. Let's imagine that God creates a person, so with a soul and a body, right? So it creates a person in midair. So that's why they're flying, why the man is flying. It doesn't have to be a man, obviously. It could be a woman, but let's say it's a man. So we've got this flying man. So he's floating in midair and he can't see anything. Not because he's blind, so all of his cognitive powers work just fine. Like he can see and hear and everything, but Avicenna says that his sight is veiled. I think it actually would be maybe enough if it's just pitch dark. But anyway, he can't see. There's nothing for him to see, or he can't see, and it's completely quiet. Ibn Sina says that there's no wind, so he's probably not falling. He's probably floating in midair. So again, the flying man. You don't want him to be falling because then he'd sort of feel the wind whistling past him. And his limbs are splayed out so that he's not in contact with his own body. So
This is so detailed.
Yeah, you'll see why it's important in a second. So he's not doing like this or even this. Everything's sort of splayed out. So the point of all of this is to put the flying man in a context of complete sensory deprivation, right? So he's not obviously not smelling or tasting anything. There's no noise, so he can't hear anything. He can't see anything, and he's not touching anything. The reason why people always forget to wonder why he has to be in midair, and the reason is that if he wasn't, he'd be touching the ground.
Right.
Okay. So what this means is that he has no sensory input at all. Sometimes people here object, like, what about proprioception? Like, if you do this, close your eyes and stick out your arm, you can still feel where your arm is. And he would have that. To which my answer is, God just turns that off.
Yeah. This already sounds, though, like contemporary philosophy of mind.
Absolutely. Right? It's amazing.
Yeah, that's great.
Just a brilliant thought experiment. So anyway, you can fiddle with the thought experiment however you need to get the person to be complete sensory deprivation. Furthermore, it's important that he's only just been created by God, because it means that he has no memories of having a body or having a sensation, right? So he has no sensation. He has no access to his body. So he doesn't know that he has a body. That's really what he's striving for. He doesn't know that he has a body right now. He can't have any memories of having a body because he only just started to exist. And now Avicenna says, well, is there anything he could know at all? And the answer is, he thinks it's just obvious that the flying man would know that he exists.
Mm-hmm.
So the flying man could just kind of introspect, would just be self-aware automatically, even without having to make an effort, that he would just be self-aware. And then, as Avicenna says, if you're aware of one thing and not aware of the other thing, then they must be different. So since he's aware of his self and he's not aware of his body, his self is not his body. Therefore, his self is immaterial. Ta-da!
That is pretty genius.
It is genius, yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
It spawned a huge literature, of which I'm guilty of contributing to it. So it's like something you can discuss for a long time. It's a lot of fun to teach to students, actually.
Yeah. Well, it's also, I mean, very reminiscent of modern issues in the philosophy of language, or contemporary issues. I mean, like sense and reference,
and people
morning star, evening star.
People, definitely. Yeah, there's a sense reference issue. You're kind of already thinking ahead to an objection there, which is that he might be aware of himself without being aware of his body, without realizing that his self is his body. Like, you could be aware of the morning star without being aware of the evening star, without knowing that they're the same star.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Or rather, you could be aware of the morning star without being aware of the evening star, and yet it could still be the case that they're the same star, namely Venus, right? So similarly, the flying man could be aware of his self but not aware of his body, and yet they could be the same. He's just not aware of himself under the description of being a body or something. And there's various ways of trying to defend Avicenna from that objection. So anyway, it's super interesting. People also have compared it to Descartes' cogito.
Yeah, I thought of that.
It seems to appeal to self-awareness or the intuition of self. Of one's
majorly anticipates that.
Yeah, so it's a very exciting thing. Yeah, and there's like I said, there's a lot written about it.
What did you write about it?
So I wrote an article together with one of the researchers who used to be here in Munich. He's now in Edinburgh. His name is Fedor Benovich. And we were arguing for a kind of complicated reading of the whole passage, which avoids the kind of morning star or evening star objection by claiming that what Avicenna is doing there is trying to rule out that the soul's relationship to the body is essential. So what we wanted to say is that since the flying man has like a direct intuitive grasp of his own self, since in Avicenna's theory of essentiality, so he spent a lot of the paper talking about what Avicenna thought about as essences. And so what we say is that if whenever you grasp the essence of something, or you grasp something in itself, you have to have access to all of the preconditions of its existence. So like, if there's some condition that needs to be satisfied for this thing to exist or to be what it is, then you must grasp it if you're grasping its essence. Okay. So just to give an example, you can't grasp what a triangle is without grasping that it has three sides. But you could grasp what a triangle is without grasping that it's purple, if it's a purple
Yeah.
triangle, because purple
Right.
doesn't belong to the essence of triangle. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
what we're arguing in the article is that the flying man, according to Avicenna, is grasping his own essence, or maybe the essence of his own self, or something like that. But he's got like an immediate grasp of himself, right? So he's not missing anything. He's not missing any essential properties, and yet he doesn't know about the body. So obviously, the body is nothing that's essential to the soul. It could be that there's an accidental relationship between the soul and the body, and of course, lo and behold, there is, right? The soul is in a body accidentally, at least for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But it can't be that the body is essentially related to the soul, because otherwise he couldn't have this grasp of his own essence without grasping the body. That's our reading. And you can see
I
that
can
that gets around the morning star, evening star thing, right?
I can see how some of this goes back to Aristotle because as it happens, I was listening to you talk probably about 10 years ago in 2012 when you were still doing Aristotle this morning. But I was listening to some of the episodes on zoology, and
Oh yeah,
I think you were talking about a giraffe, and it was about whether or not giraffes long necks are essential to them, or if it has spots, that's not essential to it because you could imagine it
yeah,
existing
absolutely.
without those spots.
I think that might even be the episode where I first introduced the giraffe example, which, as you'll see, becomes a running gag throughout the whole
Yeah.
podcast. So lots of giraffes in your future if you keep listening.
I will. I will be. So we've talked about Ibn Sina. There are obviously tons of other philosophers in the Islamic world, and we've talked about. Well, you mentioned Al-Farabi.
Mhm.
What were his metaphysics, and how did they relate to Aristotle and the other Greek thinkers?
Yeah. Okay. So actually, we're moving chronologically backwards now because
Backwards in
he's
time.
a
Okay.
couple of generations before Ibn Sina, and he is very influenced by Neoplatonism. So that's a whole other story. But Neoplatonism is like a tradition of late ancient philosophy that sort of fuses Aristotle, Plato, and some Stoicism. So there's several ideas that kind of come through to Al-Farabi through the translation movement, and one of them in particular is the idea that God is generating the cosmos not through like a freely willed act of creation. So this is like what we were talking about with Ibn Sina. So he's a kind of precursor or a foreshadowing of Ibn Sina in this regard. So instead of like thinking of God as the creator, think of God as being something more like an emanating light from which everything else just comes forth necessarily. And this theory of emanation is something that we already find in late antiquity with Neoplatonists like Plotinus, and it then gets picked up by philosophers in the Islamic world like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. So Al-Farabi is, like I say, an interesting and important predecessor of Ibn Sina. But something else that he does that's really clever is that he then says that the this is a bit complicated. It has to do with his cosmology, but there's a whole series of intellects which descend in a kind of chain from God, sort of like emanated lights, each one emanating a further light. That's sort of the metaphor. And these different intellects are responsible for the motions of the heavens. So, like each sphere of like each planetary sphere, like so let's say the sphere of Mercury, the sphere of Venus, has an intellect which is explaining its motions, which we can see when we do astronomy. And then the lowest of the intellects is the source of, for example, prophetic revelation.
The
So
lowest.
yeah, the lowest one. So he thinks, so you could sort of think of these intellects as being like angels. And I remember I said before, an angel appeared to Muhammad and told him to
For the
recite.
Quran, yeah.
This is Al-Farabi's understanding of that, is that an intellect sort of beams the revealed knowledge into Muhammad's soul. And then Muhammad is able to like use his highly developed imagination to present this knowledge to the wider public. So that's what he thinks is going on in Revelation. So there's a good example of the fact that it's not only the theologians who are interested in prophecy, it's also the philosophers who want to give philosophical accounts of how prophecy works.
Well, maybe this leads us to some of the, I don't know if you would classify what I'm about to mention as some sort of mystic tradition, but I saw that there was a philosopher by the name of Suravardi, founder of the Illuminationist tradition. And because you mentioned light, I see that his metaphysics it has to do with light. Are they related?
Definitely. And he not only is he influenced by Neoplatonism, but he kind of makes a big deal about being influenced by Neoplatonism in a way that Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina don't. So he says, "Oh, I am following the Greek sages and also the sages of India and other ancient civilization and Persia, like the Zoroastrian cult, Zoroastrian history." So he has this idea that his philosophy is a kind of culmination of all of these different ancient traditions that have kind of filtered through to him. But on the other hand, he's also using a lot of ideas that he's getting from Ibn Sina. I think more from Ibn Sina than from Al-Farabi. But Al-Farabi, like we said, is very influential in Ibn Sina. So he's kind of another figure in the line. But he goes much further into this whole light metaphor terminology business. So he says that God is a pure light and that the other intellects are also pure lights, which are like shedding illumination on the physical cosmos. And he talks about bodies as being like dark barriers which intercept the light and stop it from propagating further. So he has this kind of almost like dualist world of bodies and intelligible or spiritual entities, where he thinks of the bodies as being dark and the spiritual entities as being light. And this is something that he explains in a work called Hikmat al-Ishraq, which means the philosophy of illumination, which then becomes quite influential later on in like Persian philosophies. So like there's a later philosopher named Mullah Sadra who's very powerfully influenced by Suhrawardi. I mean, it's interesting that you kind of framed the question about him by talking about mysticism. So there's quite a lot of debate about the sense in which these figures are mystical. And Mullah Sadra later, so this later Persian thinker, who's really like from the early modern period, like 17th century. So he's definitely influenced by Sufism, the mystical tradition. Suhrawardi says some things that sound mystical. So he says some things that sound like he might like the idea of mysticism. So he says that, you know, there are some truths that you can only grasp by experience and not through reasoning and so on. But it's actually not so clear to me that he's a proper mystic, because it seems like actually his ideas pretty much all come out of the rational philosophical tradition we've been talking about.
How do you use the word mysticism in this philosophical setting?
Really difficult. That's really difficult. So I mean,
I guess it goes with the territory.
Yeah, right. All these things are difficult. That's why it's interesting. I mean, it's sort of like theology versus philosophy, right? Because as we've been saying, that's a false dichotomy, given how much philosophy was being done by the theologians and how much theology is being done by the philosophers. And similarly, I'm unhappy with the idea of contrasting mysticism and philosophy, which is, again, something people often do. So I think in all of the medieval cultures, you have a kind of interpenetration of philosophy and mysticism. So there's a lot of, for example, there's a lot of Avicennaist philosophy in great mystic philosophers like Ibn Arabi, who's a famous philosopher from Andalus, or later on Mullah Sadra. There's a lot of philosophy in Jewish Kabbalah. The philosophers, or the mystics rather, who were working in the medieval period in Europe, in Christian Europe, are often very influenced by philosophy. So I kind of consider medieval mysticism to be part of the history of philosophy.
But are there defining characteristics of what it means to be a mystic in generically?
Yeah, so I guess really all what I just said just means, well, whatever we think mysticism means, it shouldn't be incompatible with being a philosopher, right?
Okay.
So what I
Right.
think
Right.
mysticism fundamentally is the view that there are some truths that we can, or that some people can access, namely mystics, that are not accessible through natural human means.
Hmm.
So it's something like you need to directly witness it, and it can only be witnessed by someone who is given a vision, for
Yeah.
example. It
This.
often also comes along with the idea that the vision needs to be interpreted, and that maybe the mystic is the only person who could. So, for example, Hildegard of Bingen is a great example of a philosophical mystic. So she had these visions, and she wrote a work where she presents the visions and describes them, and they're kind of like poetic descriptions full of imagery and so on, like, you know, a giant on top of a mountain, and then there's all this other stuff going on. It's like this really amazing, like something out of the book of Revelations or something. And then you sort of turn the page and she says, okay, now here's the meaning of the entire vision, and she kind of goes through and explains it all, right? But the mystical part is at least having the vision in the first place. So you can't just like sit down and decide to have a vision. It sort of comes unbidden, right? And it might be something that grants you insights that people wouldn't otherwise be able to have. And also you might be able to understand your visions in a kind of privileged way that other people wouldn't be able to. So like if someone else is kind of given a description of Hildegard's vision, they wouldn't be able to say what it means, but she can. But anyway, I mean, mysticism doesn't have to come in the form of visions, obviously, but that's a good example, because the general idea to me of mysticism is that there's some kind of knowledge or access to being or truth or God or whatever it is that transcends the ability of people to just use their inborn cognitive apparatus. So you can't just decide to be a mystic and have mystical insight. You can maybe practice and train to do it by doing things like, you know, fasting or doing other kinds of ascetic activities, but you can't do, like, reason your way to a mystical experience. It has to kind of come to you. And so it's in a way, I always think of mysticism as being, you know, really deeply philosophical, because it's kind of a thesis about epistemology, namely that there's this kind of knowledge, which is a special kind of knowledge, which can't be accessed through the way we normally access knowledge.
I've been reading and thinking about epistemology and the philosophy of math lately, and I haven't seen the word mystic thrown around there at all, but I can imagine people charging Gödel or other realists about mathematics as mystics because they purport to have knowledge about mathematical truths, perhaps mathematical objects where there's no plausible or generally agreed upon as plausible mechanism for obtaining this information. So obviously they're not maintaining that they have visions or anything like that, but in a negative sense you might want to call them a mystic. But okay, that's interesting. It's a good word for me
Intuition,
to know.
right?
They were
So,
using intuition, but there's a lot of debate about is intuition a real thing? I mean, you can't really explain what intuition is scientifically, really, or in a compelling way that gives you access to abstract objects. Or, I mean, some people would say that.
yeah,
But so,
I mean, historically, there's quite a powerful and long-running link between mysticism and Platonism. So it's interesting that you raised that in the context of Gödel, because and you can see the two things go together really well, right? So if you're a Platonist, you might believe that there are these entities which transcend the natural sphere, and so then the next thought could be, well, if we have the kind of cognitive apparatus which is built for understanding nature, but now we have these supernatural entities, and they could be mathematical entities, they could be God. I mean, you sort of fill in your Platonic forms, right? There's a lot of things they could be. And now we're just going to say, well, that must mean we have some additional kind of knowledge, or it's like some people have it at least, which gives them access to these intelligible or super intelligible objects. So I think that's actually a really good point that you just made, that like Platonism is very susceptible to accusations of being mystical, and it's often explicitly mystical.
Now, is there a mystical element to the Illuminationist tradition, or is it just the name Illuminationist that like rings my alarm bells?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely true that later Illuminationists like Mullah Sadra are very strongly influenced by Sufism. So
Okay,
it's certainly true that
so what is
illumination
Sufism then?
comes.
Because
Well, Sufism is really just the word for mysticism in Islam.
oh, okay,
And so it's often, in this case, it's often associated with the ideas of Ibn Arabi, who's around the time of Suhrawardi and is a really important philosophical Sufi. And he wrote huge, very extensive books, which are about like the revealing of truth to mystic insight and so on. And he'll do things like talking about the deeper meaning of all of the different prophets or the names of God and so on. Right. So it's very, very Quranic what he's doing, very scripturally based. But there's also a lot of philosophy in there. So he's influenced by Ibn Sina. So there's a lot of kind of mixing up of Kalam, Sufism, and Falsafa in this period. So we're talking about roughly like maybe the 11th, 12th century onward. And what makes someone a Sufi is to some extent just like how willing are they to endorse these kind of special ways of having knowledge, like non-discursive forms of knowledge or direct apprehension of God. Something that's quite distinctive of Sufism and Islam is that a lot of them claim to be able to either directly behold God, which is something you see a lot in Christian mysticism, or they'll go even further and say that they actually become one with God. So they talk about annihilation of the self, where the distance between God and the mystic completely disappears, and the mystic kind of dissolves into God's essence.
and I'm now realizing that Al-Ghazali was a Sufi.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So he actually wrote an intellectual autobiography in which he talks about the way that he kind of moves through a whole bunch of different attempts to grasp God and winds up finding mystical union with God to be the only like fully satisfying way of getting to God, which is bad news for people who don't have mystical experiences, obviously.
Yeah. I'm now realizing that I have a note. I had a note and I don't know why I made it, but it was to ask you why the Illuminationists wondered whether they would be reborn as giraffes.
Yeah, there's a later so one of the episodes that comes on later, right, I think it's right after the Suhrawardi one, is about other Illuminationists, and one of the things that they talk about is reincarnation. So again, that's something that's often associated with Platonism, and again you can see why. So if you're like a very strong dualist and you think that the body can survive the death, sorry, if you think the soul can survive the death of the body, then what's to prevent you from thinking that the soul could leave one body and then go to another body, right? So like the soul of your great great grandmother could be now in your cat, right? And of course, this is something we find in a lot of ancient cultures. So Plato talks about this himself. We find it in India and so on. And the Illuminationists knew about this, and they knew that Plato was somehow associated with the theory of reincarnation. I guess they knew that. And so, being dualists about the soul, they started wondering whether or not you can expect to be reincarnated. There's a kind of a debate within theories of transmigration of souls or reincarnation, which is that even if you believe that the soul could be reincarnated, that doesn't necessarily mean that you could be reincarnated as a member of another species, right? So there's kind of like mild reincarnationism where humans are reincarnated as humans, and then there's really hardcore reincarnationism where humans can be reincarnated as animals and vice versa.
Well, here's a very pressing question, then I've been thinking a lot lately about eating meat, whether I want to continue doing it, if I do, how I should be doing it. And I was talking to a friend of mine about it, and he told me that there were actually ancient discussions around vegetarianism for just this reason. Because what if my great-great-grandmother was not my cat, but the lamb I'm going to have for dinner, or the lamb I'm going to sacrifice? Is this a concern also in the Islamic world?
Okay. So, well, first let's talk about the ancient case. So you're right.
Please.
So actually, for example, there's a pre-Socratic philosopher named Empedocles who was in favor of vegetarianism, and there's a part of his poems where he says he sort of imagines someone sacrificing an animal, and the person to sacrifice doesn't realize that they're sacrificing a member of their own family who's now reincarnated as this animal, right? And then in late antiquity, you have Porphyry, who's a Neoplatonist, arguing in favor of vegetarianism. He doesn't really.
He's a Neoplatonist. Okay, cool.
Yeah, he's actually the student of the founder of Neoplatonism,
of Plotinus.
And he edited Plotinus's works as well. So he wrote this amazing text. I actually just taught it a couple of weeks ago. So it's a work entirely devoted to arguing that philosophers should not eat meat. So he doesn't really.
Porphyry wrote that?
Yeah.
I'm taking a course on him in the spring, so that's good to know.
Oh, great. Okay, you'll get to read it probably.
Yeah, with Alan Code. Well, it's just going to be on Porphyry's logic. So probably not on his vegetarianism.
But at least you can say, why does he? So actually, one of his arguments is that, at least by the standards that the Stoics used for saying that humans are rational, animals are rational too, because they can talk, in his opinion, and they can understand language. And so actually, I had another grad student named Faye Edwards who wrote a PhD thesis and then published some articles about this, where she pointed out that this definition that you get in Porphyry's logical works of humans as being rational animals actually isn't a good definition, because he thinks that other animals are also rational. They're just not as clever as humans, but they are rational. Anyway, so in India, you also have obviously vegetarianism, which may be to some extent motivated by reincarnation. I think in the Islamic world, belief in reincarnation was vanishingly unusual. So sometimes it was ascribed to this philosopher I've worked on named Razi. So he kind of tentatively makes some remarks about maybe we shouldn't be it's a little bit more complicated than that. He's talking about how you should avoid cruelty towards animals, and then he says, well, there's some animals that you're allowed to kill, like vermin, snakes, so on, because they do a lot of harm, and also you might be doing them a favor because you're getting their souls out of their terrible bodies. And then other people, I think what happens is that other people said, oh, Razi obviously believed in reincarnation, and his point must be that by killing the snake, you'd be allowing the snake to be reborn as a human. She'd be doing it a favor.
This reminds me of the shivering and the striking someone, and free will and necessity breeding inventivity or creativity. He just wants to get rid of those rats, so now he's got to justify it to himself. It's just freeing them from those bodies.
It's too counterintuitive to not be allowed to kill rats, so you have to explain why.
How did the history of philosophy without any gaps get started in 2010?
Yeah, okay, so a long time ago, obviously. So I guess by the time this airs, it'll be 2023, because we're doing this. It's almost New Year's Eve, right?
Yeah, this will come out on Monday, so it'll be January 1st.
Oh, wow. Okay. So Happy New Year, everybody. So it'll be just going on for 13 years, I guess. So it actually launched, I think, in October of 2010. So it's 12 years plus a bit old. And actually, the reason I started doing it was that I was listening to podcasts when I was going running. And I kind of just noticed that there was no history of philosophy podcast. and I'm a historian of philosophy, right? So I guess the reason I noticed it was especially because I was listening to a lot of history podcasts and a lot of philosophy podcasts, and I thought, well, someone should really like bring these two things together. Something I especially liked about history podcasts. So my model really was this a series called The History of Rome by someone named Mike Duncan. And actually, in a sort of coming full circle mode, he then did another very long running podcast called Revolutions, which tells the story of like the English Civil War, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and so on, and ends with the Russian Revolution. And I just listened to the very last episode this morning, actually. So he's someone who inspired me a lot. But just in general, I really liked the idea that if you were doing a podcast, you could just like really take your time and move through a story bit by bit. So for example, in his History of Rome series, the earlier series he did, he just like, if he gets to a battle, he would spend like 40 minutes explaining the battle and why it happened, and which flank gave way, and like really getting into the details. And there's a kind of frustration I guess I've always had with teaching history of philosophy. I mean, I love teaching, but it's a little bit frustrating because there's so much more in the history of philosophy than you can get across in a class, right?
Yeah,
like,
I mean, we've talked for 2 hours and we've touched on nothing in a way.
Exactly, yeah. And even like if you think of a whole semester, like for example, in this coming spring, I'm giving the lecture on ancient philosophy here, and even if all I wanted to do is cover Plato and Aristotle, I'd have to be incredibly selective about doing that. So, I mean, the course runs for something like 15 weeks, once a week. So, I can do 15 topics in Plato and Aristotle, and that would only be Plato and Aristotle, never mind all of ancient Greek philosophy, never mind all of ancient Greek and Chinese and Indian philosophy, right? Which you might think is sort of the minimum of what ancient philosophy really is. So, for that reason, and also because I like this idea of getting into philosophy in other cultures, especially Islamic philosophy, because that's what I do. I just thought, well, like the way I think about the history of philosophy would really lend itself to a podcast where you can just like go week by week and go through the whole thing. And that's why I called it the history of philosophy without any gaps, because the idea was like when I got to Aristotle, let's say, so right where you are now, the episode after Aristotle wouldn't be like Augustine or Plotinus or Aquinas or something. It would be literally the students of Aristotle, So I would like go through each sort of generation or phase of philosophy without leaving anything out. That was always the idea. And as I say, I think I've adhered to the idea more as I've gone along. So, I mean, nowadays, anything I can think of that could arguably be covered in a history of philosophy, I try to get it in somehow, even if I only touch on it in passing. Whereas at the beginning, that wasn't really true. So, like a really good example is that I didn't have an episode on Herodotus and Thucydides, so these great historians. And then later, when I was doing Byzantine philosophy, I kind of apologized for this and said, well, now I'm going to cover Byzantine historians who were reading Thucydides and Herodotus. And I should have covered them back then, but now I'm at least going to tell you about the people who were influenced by them.
It's a good workaround.
Yeah, kind of. Although, actually, I think I have this idea that when I get to episode 500, because that's not that far away, I'm in the 400s now, I might do an episode where I cover things that I missed.
An episode or a series of episodes?
I'm not sure yet. It depends how serious I get about it. But if it was a series of episodes, I would definitely do one on Herodotus and Thucydides. I think that's actually the one thing I most regret not doing, actually, is those two historians, because I did do some other features of classical culture, like I did the Hippocratic corpus. I at least touched on Homer and Hesiod, but I really didn't say anything about the historians, and that was a real gap. So I regret that. But of course, there's lots of other things I missed. There always will
And
be.
there are lots of different ways of doing a philosophy podcast. I mean, you have Barry Lamb's, which is more narrative driven. You have Kieran Setia's, which is really more philosopher driven. Then you have this one that's more conversational. Why did you decide, or how did you decide to structure it the way you did, where it's a lot of it is almost essay like, and then a lot of it is also dialogical in this sense for some episodes?
Yeah. So my basic concept of it was to do it as a history podcast. So I thought of it as like a history podcast about philosophy. That was really my model. And so my initial thought was to just do it like that and have scripted episodes. I knew I wanted it to be scripted because when I listen to podcasts myself, I don't mind conversations like this sort of work for me, but I don't like it when people do monologues that aren't scripted because they kind of wander all over the place, and I want it to be tight, and I just want them to think about what they want to tell me. So I mean, obviously, it's just a matter of taste. There's nothing wrong with
Right.
people can have podcasts however they want, but I was kind of trying to write a podcast or design a podcast that I would want to listen to. But then I had a couple of thoughts about why it would be good to include interviews, and I've always had to have interviews every like 5 or 6 episodes. So one is practical, which is that it's one less episode I have to write. This is a lot quicker to call someone up and send them some questions than to write a whole episode. So it takes. I mean, my podcast is weekly, so it's quite a relentless schedule, and I've been doing it for a long time and have managed to keep on the schedule, but it's hard to keep up with it. And so the interviews help me do that. But more the deeper reason is that I just thought it would be good for people to get another voice, like maybe different perspective on the same thing. I also was a little bit worried even then, and I've gotten more worried about that since then. I was a little bit worried about like being the kind of authoritative voice white guy telling you about the history of philosophy. So I've always tried to have like quite a diverse selection of interview guests. So I tried even to sort of aim for 50-50 women and men. Obviously, I have to find someone who's an expert on whatever I'm dealing with. And there's a lot more men in philosophy than women, but I still have, tried to have at least some attempt at gender parity. So that was really more, it was really more about diversifying the experience for the listener and not being trapped within what I think is important and what's worth knowing about.
I think that's a really nice move to have made. It's also just nice to break, not just that it's your voice, but to break up the flow a little bit. So that
right.
I think that worked very nicely.
And I think it's also reinforcing. So especially, another thing about the podcast is that originally I didn't have any idea that it would be a book. So sometimes originally I would sometimes have an episode where instead of writing an episode about something, I would just have an interview about it instead. So for example, when I did Galen, who's a late ancient doctor, the world's leading expert on philosophy in Galen, Jim Hankinson, was in London where I was at the time. So I just interviewed him. I was like, well, so why should I write an episode about Jim Hankinson right here, right? But then when I decided to make them books, so I always revise the scripts and then turn them into books. And then I just had to sit down and write a chapter about Galen anyway, because I could not have Galen in there, right? So because by the way, the interviews don't appear in the books. So since that happened, since I started thinking about it more as both a podcast and a book project, now I always have interviews about things I've already covered in the scripted episodes. And actually, I think that's really good because it reinforces it for the listener and gives them another perspective on something they've already heard me talk about. And so they get to see like, oh, okay, so the guest is maybe emphasizing some different things or is getting deeper into it or whatever. And maybe they also remember what they heard better if it's gone over twice, you know.
No, that's a really nice pedagogical move. So I like that. And so it's always nice for me to hear how other people are thinking these things through. Now, how long do you think that the project will take? Like, is it something that you're just going to, I'm sure you get that question a lot, but do you intend, I mean, you're a historian of philosophy. Are you going to come up to contemporary philosophy, or are you going to stop at like 1600 or 1700 or?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a good question. So there's a difference between what I thought when I started and what I think now. So when I started, I thought I would maybe end with Kant, just because it seemed like everything after that would get too close to now. But then, like, actually, even a long time ago, I started thinking, wait, would you really stop and not do Hegel and like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche? Like, people would certainly want to hear about Nietzsche, right? Or for that matter, you know, I don't know, Frege, right? So surely, like, the whole 19th century, right? How could you not do that?
The slippery slope.
Yeah, the slippery slope, exactly. And the other thing is that when I first began, I would have been very surprised to learn that I'd ever get up to 400 episodes. So I think so I wasn't planning to do Chinese and Indian philosophy. It hadn't even occurred to me that I could do African or Africana philosophy. And now we've done both classical Indian philosophy and Africana philosophy. So I'm up to 400 in the numbering of the original series, but if you include the episodes I've done with co-authors, so I did with Janardhan Ganeri, I did Indian philosophy. With G.K. Jeffers, I've been doing Africana philosophies. I'm already up towards something like 600 episodes, if you count those. And I'm going to have Chinese philosophy soon with Karen Lai, once Africana philosophy is done. So it's just gotten like the whole project has just gotten ridiculous and kind of
it's awesome.
Gone way, way, way beyond. Like, the mission creep has been absurd, right? So now, given how slowly I go, I mean, it's every week, so in a way it's very quick, but it's very slowly in the sense that it's taking me like 2 years to do just the 16th century, you know, which is not even a period where most people could name a philosopher. Like, can you name a 16th century philosopher?
No.
Yeah, exactly, right. So probably the only one who would come to mind for most people would be Montaigne. He's 16th century.
Okay.
But I mean, a lot of the more famous, and actually Machiavelli wrote in the early 16th century, so he's pretty famous. Okay. But there's really, so even periods where there's like no famous philosophers, it's still taking me months and months and months to go through it. And so I can't imagine what's going to happen when I get to the 17th century. It's just going to be ridiculous.
Yeah, you've got your work cut out for you.
Yeah, so I think I'll be in the 17th and 18th century for, I mean, assuming I get to keep going, I'm sure that will take me 7 or 8 years. So if I'm doing Chinese and philosophy, whatever, in alternating weeks. So I don't even worry about this, and I always just say I have no plans to stop anytime soon.
Yeah.
The other thing I say, which is a little bit darker, which is that I think rather than stopping the podcast, I will be stopped by something like death or illness or something that makes it impossible for me to keep producing a weekly podcast. So I'm actually a little bit afraid that it will stop like in the middle somewhere. You know, I'll be like just about to get to Hegel or something, and I'll get sick or, you know, drop dead or something because I'll be 80 by then. And I think that's probably how we'll end, but we'll see.
Hopefully, I'm always like attracted to Herculean tasks and magnum opuses. So it's, I mean, very cool. Now, if you could give yourself any advice when you started 12 years ago, almost 13 years ago, that you think, like, what could you have told yourself that would have made like the biggest impact on how the past 13 years have gone?
I mean, so I'm kind of a fan of the idea that if you're happy with where you wound up, then you shouldn't give in to the temptation of thinking that it would be really good if you could go back and mess with things, right? So probably I wouldn't change very much. But I think the main thing I would change is I would say I would probably try to describe the way the project would be so that I did the classical philosophy stuff in a way that was more like what I did later. So I would say, hey, actually, it's going to turn out that this is a book series. So when you're writing the scripts, don't just kind of slap them down, which is what you're planning to do. Like, keep notes, put footnotes, cite bibliography and stuff, because I had to go all in and do all that later with the first book, which was quite a pain. And also, the first book is just a lot less kind of deep and detailed than the later books and podcasts that became those books. So I would actually say, what you're, to my former self, I would say what you're proposing to do here is already preposterously ambitious. Just lean into that and be even more ambitious. Like, think of what you're doing as an attempt to like tell everything you can think of that might be interesting for a broad audience, because to me that's the real appeal of the whole thing. Because of course there's like any number of great historians of philosophy and histories of philosophy, and really a lot of the time all I'm doing is sort of distilling their work for a wider audience. But I think the thing that's unusual or maybe even unique about my project that makes it worthwhile is that it's simultaneously very, very detailed and fine-grained and aimed at a broad audience. So that's really the combination I was going for. And so I think that, it would have been nice if the classical philosophy stuff was just as fine-grained as the stuff on medieval philosophy that I got to later. Mm-hmm. But basically, I'm pretty happy with the way it went. So
I'm happy with the way it's
not
going.
Too many complaints about my former self.
All right. Well, this has been absolutely awesome. I learned a ton about stuff that I didn't know existed, and that's always good. And hopefully, maybe somewhere down the line we can do another one and talk about some of the philosophers we didn't get to, and then Neoplatonism, Platonism as well.
Sure, I'd love to. And it's nice to meet you and your cat.